come about!
FBI! Clear right! Lock it down! Lock it down!
Wait! I'm just a cousin! I'm just a cousin! Get off my grandmama's carpet! She don't like nobody on the carpet, especially police!
From Chelsea Manning to Edward Snowden, whistleblowers have been trying to expose the truth within our government for decades. A whistleblower is any person who exposes any kind of information or activity that is deemed illegal, unethical, or not correct within an organization that is either private or public. Whistleblowers are, in my opinion, some of the most underappreciated patriots in our country. They have everything to lose and little to gain by exposing the truth behind the curtain. Yet they do it out of the hope that people will realize what is actually happening, and their reward include running and hiding, exile, incarceration, or death. Today we will be looking at 4 famous whistleblowers of the last few decades to see what they uncovered and what their punishment was. I hope this sheds light on just how costly the right thing to do may be sometimes. Linda Tripp. This former White House staff member was a key figure in the Monica Lewinsky scandal that led to an attempt to remove President Bill Clinton from office during his second term.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky.
If I ever want to have an affair with a married man again, especially if he's president, please shoot me.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
But you know, I don't know, maybe I'm being an idiot. I don't want to have to work for this position.
Say that
I
again.
want it to be given to me.
Right, you don't want to go through the whole interview process
Right.
and you want to know that you have a position.
Right.
All right, so then maybe you want to stay secure.
I'd like to secure me a position.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Linda's actions in secretly recording Monica Lewinsky's confidential phone calls about her relationship with the president caused many media outlets to take these juicy details and run headlines. Tripp also confirmed the existence of a navy blue dress that Lewinsky owned that was soiled with Clinton's semen. During their friendship, Monica had shown the dress to Linda and said she intended to have it dry cleaned. However, Linda convinced her not to go through with it. Linda claimed that her motives were purely patriotic. She was able to avoid a wiretap charge in exchange for handing in the tapes. She then claimed that her firing from the Pentagon at the end of the Clinton administration was vindictive, while the administration claimed it to be a standard routine. Linda was never punished for her actions and now works with her husband in a retail business in Middleburg, Virginia. Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden was a former CIA employee who was contracted to the NSA, where he found and copied highly classified information from the National Security Agency, also known as the NSA. He then leaked this information to several journalists, and Edward Snowden came to international attention after stories based on the material appeared in The Guardian and The Washington Post. So what were these documents about? Basically, the NSA is watching you, everything you do, and me, I'm sure I'm on a watch list right now as I speak. Now, we always knew the NSA had this power. The whole reason it was founded was to locate terrorists before they had a chance to strike a target. Much of the NSA's defense is that the public should be unconcerned, summed up by if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. However, cell phones, laptops, Facebook, Skype, and chat rooms all allow the NSA to build what it calls a pattern of life, a detailed profile of a target and anyone associated with them. And the number of people caught up in this could be huge. You don't need to be talking to a terror subject to have your communications data analyzed by the NSA. The agency is allowed to travel 3 hops from its targets. Who could be people who talk to the people who talk to the people who talk to you? The NSA, faced with the growing public and political concern over the quantities of data it was collecting, the NSA has sought to reassure people, arguing that it collected only a tiny proportion of the world's internet traffic, roughly equivalent to a dime on a basketball court. But in reality, that is still a huge amount of data. The Library of Congress, one of the greatest libraries in the world, gathers 5 terabytes a month. The NSA sucks up much, much more. But there's no way this is legal, right? The U.S. Patriot Act was quickly developed as an anti-terrorism legislation in response to the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. The large and complex law received little congressional oversight and was signed into law by President George W. Bush on October 26, 2001. Nobody noticed what this law entailed because there was such an uprising in patriotism to fight these terrorists that we wanted to get them by any means necessary. However, the Patriot Act gives sweeping search and surveillance to domestic law enforcement and foreign intelligence agencies, and eliminates checks and balances that previously gave courts the opportunity to ensure that these powers were not abused. The Patriot Act and the follow-up legislation now threaten the basic rights of millions of Americans. At that point, privacy became a thing of the past. On June 21, 2013, the U.S. Department of Justice charged Snowden with 2 accounts of espionage and theft of government property, which could be punishable by death. Snowden fled to Moscow, but Russian authorities noted that his U.S. passport had been canceled, and he was restricted to the airport terminal for over 1 month. Russia ultimately recognized his right to flee the country due to the outstanding circumstances. They granted him a visa for residence for 1 year. Repeated extensions have permitted him to stay at least until 2020. He is now living in an undisclosed location in Moscow. Karen Silkwood. Karen Silkwood was an American chemical technician and labor union activist known for raising concerns about corporate practices related to health and safety of workers in a nuclear factory. She worked at the Kerr-McGee Sumerian fuel fabrication site. In the summer of 1974, Silkwood testified to the Atomic Energy Commission about having been contaminated, alleging that the safety standards had slipped because of a production speed-up. On November 5th, 1974, Silkwood performed a routine self-check and found that her body contained almost 400 times the legal limit for plutonium contamination. She was decontaminated at the plant and sent home with a testing kit to collect urine and feces sample for further analysis. Although there was plutonium on the inner portions of the gloves which she had been using, the gloves did not have any holes. The next morning, as she was headed to a union negotiation meeting, Silkwood again tested positive for plutonium. Although she had performed only paperwork duties that morning, she was given a more intense decontamination. On November 7th, as she entered the plant, she was found to be dangerously contaminated, even expelling contaminated air from her lungs. A health physics team accompanied her back to her home and found plutonium traces on several surfaces, especially in the bathroom and the refrigerator. When the house was later stripped and decontaminated, some of her property had to be destroyed. Silkwood, her boyfriend Drew Stevens, and her roommate Dusty Ellis were sent to the Los Alamos National Laboratory for in-depth testing to determine the extent of contamination in their bodies. Questions arose over how Silkwood became contaminated over this 3-day period. She said the contamination in the bathroom may have occurred when she spilled her urine sample on the morning of November 7th. This was consistent with the evidence that samples she took at home had extremely high levels of contamination, while samples taken in fresh jars at the plant and at Los Alamos showed much lower contamination. She thought she had been contaminated at the plant. Kerr-McGee's management said that Silkwood had contaminated herself in order to portray the company in a negative light. Silkwood had enough. She had her documentation assembled for her claims, including company papers. She decided to go public with this evidence and contacted a New York Times journalist who was interested in her story. On November 13, 1974, Silkwood left a union meeting at the hub Hub Cafe in Crescent. Another attendee of that meeting later testified that Silkwood had a binder and a packet of documents with her at that cafe. Silkwood got into her car and headed alone for Oklahoma City later that evening. Silkwood's body was found in her car, which had been run off the road and struck a culvert. The car contained none of the documents she held in the union meeting at the Hub Cafe. She was pronounced dead at the scene in what was believed to be an accident. The trooper at the scene remembers that he found 1 or 2 tablets of sedatives in the car. He remembers finding marijuana. The police report indicated that she fell asleep at the wheel. The coroner found an amount almost twice the recommended dosage of the sedative for inducing drowsiness. Some journalists have theorized that Silkwood's car was rammed from behind by another vehicle, with the intent to cause an accident that would result in her death. Skid marks from Silkwood's car were also present on the road, suggesting that she was trying to get back onto the road after being pushed from behind. Investigators also noted damage on the rear of Silkwood's vehicle that, according to the Silkwood's friends and family, had not been present before the accident. As the crash was entirely a front-end collision, it did not explain the damage to the rear of the vehicle. A microscopic examination of the rear of Silkwood's vehicle showed paint chips that could only have come from a rear impact by another vehicle. Silkwood's family claimed to know of no accidents of any kind that Silkwood had had with the car. Her family sued Kerr McGee on behalf of her estate in what was the longest trial up until then in Oklahoma history. The jury found Kerr McGee liable for the plutonium contamination of Silkwood and awarded substantial damages. These were reduced on appeal, but the case reached the United States Supreme Court in 1979, which upheld the damages verdict. Before another trial took place, Kerr McGee settled with the estate out of court for $1.38 million. While not admitting liability, public suspicions led to a federal investigation into the plant's security and safety. National Public Radio reported that this investigation had found that 20 to 30 kilograms of plutonium had been misplaced at the plant. Kerr McGee closed its nuclear fuel plants in 1975. The Department of Energy reported the plant as decontaminated and decommissioned in 1994. Chelsea Manning. Bradley Manning is a former United States Army soldier who was convicted by court-martial in July 2013. He was convicted of violations of the Espionage Act and other serious offenses after he disclosed to WikiLeaks nearly 750,000 classified and unclassified but sensitive military and diplomatic documents. On January 5, 2010, Manning downloaded the 400,000 documents that became the Iraq War Logs. On January 8th, he downloaded 91,000 documents from the Afghanistan database, known later as part of the Afghan War Logs. He saved the material on a CD rewritable disc and smuggled it through security by labeling the CD as Lady Gaga. He then copied it onto his own personal computer. The next day, he wrote a message in a readme.txt file, which he told the court was initially intended for the Washington Post. Manning contacted the Washington Post and the New York Times to ask if they would be interested in posting this material. The Post reporter did not sound interested, and the Times did not return his call. Manning decided instead to pass it on to WikiLeaks, and on February 3rd sent them the Iraq and Afghan war logs through Tor. He returned to Iraq on February 11th with no acknowledgement from WikiLeaks. Basically, the files were terrible actions done by the US military. WikiLeaks named the Baghdad airstrike video Collateral Murder and released it on April 5th, 2010, during a press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. The video showed 2 American helicopters firing on a group of 10 men in the Amman district of Baghdad. 2 were Reuter employees there to photograph an American Humvee under attack by the Mahdi army. Pilots mistook their cameras for weapons. The helicopters also fired on a van targeted earlier by one helicopter that had stopped to help wounded members of the first group. 2 children in the van were wounded and their father was killed. Pilots also engaged a building where retreating insurgents were held up. Manning copied the files from his laptop to an SD card for his camera so that he could take it with him to the United States while on R&R leave. Army investigators later found the SD card in Manning's basement room in his aunt's house. He was imprisoned between 2010 and 2017. A newly trans woman, Manning released a statement in 2013 explaining she had a female gender identity since childhood and wanted to be known as Chelsea Manning. She also expressed a desire to begin hormone replacement therapy. Manning was placed on suicide watch after her behavior caused concern. She was moved from Kuwait to the Marine Corps base in Virginia on July 29, 2010. And classified as a maximum custody detainee with prevention of injury status, otherwise known as POI. POI status is one stop short of suicide watch, entailing checks by the guards every 5 minutes. Her lawyer, a former military attorney, said Manning was not allowed to sleep between 5 a.m. and 8 p.m. and was made to stand or sit up if she tried to. She was required to remain visible at all times, including at night, which entailed no access to sheets, no pillow, except for one that was built into her mattress, and a blanket designed not to be shredded. Manning complained that she regarded this as pretrial punishment. Her cell was 6 feet by 12 feet with no window, containing a bed, toilet, and sink. The jail had 30 cells built into a U-shape, and although detainees could talk to one another, they were unable to see each other. She was allowed to walk for up to 1 hour a day. Meals were taken to her cell and she was shackled during visits. There was access to the television when it was placed in the corridor, and she was allowed to keep 1 magazine and 1 book. Because she was in pretrial detention, she received full pay. On January 18, 2011, after Manning had an altercation with the guards, the commander classified her as a suicide risk. Manning said the guards had began issuing conflicting commands such as turn left, don't turn left, and upbraiding her for responding to commands with yes instead of I. Shortly after, she was placed on suicide watch, had her clothing and eyeglasses removed, and was required to remain in her cell 24 hours a day. The suicide watch was lifted on January 21st after a complaint from her lawyer, and the brigade commander who ordered it was replaced. On March 2nd, she was told that her request for removal of POI status had been denied. Her lawyer said Manning joked to the guards that if she wanted to harm herself, she could do so with her underwear and flip-flops. The comment resulted in Manning being ordered to strip naked in her cell that night and sleep without clothing. On the following morning, only Manning stood naked for inspection. Following her lawyer's protest and media attention, Manning was issued a sleeping garment. On March 11th, when she went to trial, Manning was charged with 22 offenses, including aiding the enemy, which was the most serious charge and could have resulted in a death sentence. She was sentenced to 35 years at the maximum security U.S. disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth. However, in 2017, President Barack Obama commuted Manning's sentence to nearly 7 years. She was released in 2017 and earned a living through speaking engagements. On March 8, 2019, she was held in contempt of court and jailed in Alexandria, Virginia, with a judge conditioning her release on her testifying or the grand jury concluding its work. She was released in May 2019, but then was ordered back to jail until she testifies in the WikiLeaks inquiry. The judge also added a fine of $500 for every day she remains in custody after 30 days and $1,000 for every day she remains in custody after 60 days. But now I want to know what you guys believe. Do you believe these people deserve the treatment they received after exposing the truth? Let us know in the comments below. We hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please leave a like and maybe even subscribe for more great content. We do all the research so you don't have to. And as always, I'm Alex, and I hope you have a fantastic day.
Cuts deeper than the roots of the trees that we planted in the graveyard. I don't think these scars will ever fade off. Good thing nothing seems to faze us. So numb.